So the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, I pray that we would learn more deeply about history, that we might not repeat it, that we may be instruments of your peace. Amen.
Amen. All right, everybody. Like I just said, I'm going to do things a little bit differently this time around. It's going to, so the syllabus says, and I will be kind of within the syllabus, 1865 to 1955. The reason I chose those dates is the Civil War ends in 1865, and that's the official year that emancipation went into effect. And 90 years later, in 1955, people consider that the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. That will be my lecture next week, a kind of lecture on the Civil Rights Movement. So kind of think of this as in between those grand surges or those grand changes in American structure, legal structure, and changes in American culture as well. I wrote in the syllabus, and I kind of added it. I didn't think it was going to be a joke, but I actually laughed at it a little bit myself. I said, okay, so there's been emancipation. What happens next? Hint, it's not an interracial love fest. Actually, it's really horrible. Slavery is horrible. Then it's one thing to abolish an institution. It's another thing to change a culture. And so, so tonight, what I'm going to be talking about, so the title of the entire course is American Racism, History, and Healing. This kind of gets to the healing part of it. And this is where it gets difficult. It's one thing to just kind of tell the story, here's the facts, hopefully put into a compelling narrative. It's another thing to talk about how we change and how we can change, and especially change attitudes. When I talk about the Civil Rights Movement next week, and if, talking about slavery as an institution, hundreds of thousands of lives had to be lost to end slavery. So I'm in no way saying it was an easy task, and scores or hundreds of lives had to be lost to end segregation. So again, this was not an easy task, but it kind of makes an easier target when you have a law that you want changed. There's something to shoot at. There's something to just, okay, you change what's in the law books. It's much more difficult to change a culture, and it's much more difficult to change a people. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. The overall structure for the lecture is going to be that really just in two chunks. This first part is going to be kind of abstract. I think you'll find it interesting, kind of bear with me. And then the second part will get much more into kind of history, and history from 1865 to 1955. And I'm also going to talk about California a good bit. I think it'd be good to inform us, since we're in California, of some of the things that happen in California. Okay, this article I'm going to share with you, let me just introduce it first, and then I'll show you the quotes and the title of it. This is truly the most mind-blowing article that I've read in the last 10 years. I've read a lot. This one, I wasn't expecting it. I'm just like, okay, what is this? And just, I'll explain why as we go along. Okay, can you see that? Okay. Is that large enough? Do I need to enlarge it or anything? Everybody's good? Okay. Okay, the title of this is a chapter of a title, The Nightmare from Which We Are Trying to Awake, which is probably the best way to describe 2020 in the English language, in my opinion. The Nightmare from Which We Are Trying to Awake. This was actually from a book that was published in 1998 entitled The Warrior's Honor, Ethnic War and Modern Conscience, by this man, Michael Ignoctive. I was so blown away by this article, and so blown away by what this man stands for. I honestly, this I think is going to be my next area of research. I'm getting a book published soon, so that's kind of coming to a conclusion, and I'm ready to launch into my next projects, and I think it's going to be this. So bear with me as I read through some of these quotes and explain them and kind of explain what's going on. Michael Ignoctive, let me just introduce this quickly. He did work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. He also worked in Rwanda after the genocide in Rwanda, and he worked in Yugoslavia after the genocides in Yugoslavia between the Serbs, Croats, Kosovars, and just the mess that the Balkans is. So who he is, what is he thinking about? He goes into these places of profound pain and hatred and murderous, racist or sectarian violence. And then how do those communities heal from that? And the title, The Nightmare from Which We're Trying to Awake, is the past. This murder. He also talks about Germany and the Holocaust in this, although he doesn't have firsthand experience with that because the work he did was in the 90s, not in the 40s and 50s. But just know that about him as he goes into these places and works with these people as they are trying to reconcile. I don't know if he is theologically oriented or in any particular way, but what he has to say about human beings and how we kind of digest and navigate past pain and live together is just, again, I think mind-blowing. And there's a couple quotes in particular while I identify that. Okay, so these first three quotes are really good. I'm gonna take them together. What is nightmarish about nightmare is that it permits no saving distance between dreamer and dream. If history is nightmare, it's because past is not past. In other words, what haunts us when we are living in something in the present that is truly in the past, that nightmare is still with us. We haven't woken up from it. Next quote, what does it mean for a nation to come to terms with its past? Do nations have psyches the way individuals do? Can nations come awake from the nightmare of their past? So to kind of shift this from simply an individual and an individual's identity and an individual's experience of a traumatic event in the past to a collective experience of a trauma in its past and a wrestling and a struggle to get over that trauma and move forward. Period. It's always interesting to have Lucy in these classes. An entire society can experience an earthquake or a hurricane or a natural disaster. And one of the things I know Lucy's book gets at is that then in the wake of that, unfortunately, groups, there's a certain tribalism. Lucy, I'll let you say more about that. You wrote the book, not me. But then how does that society move forward after that? It wasn't any sectarian group's fault, but then sectarianism, kind of tribalism arises. How much worse is it when one group is the perpetrator and the other group is the victim? How do you then move forward? Okay, this next quote, to master trauma is not just to bring body and mind together in acceptance, it is also to recover in both body and mind a sense that past is past, that it is truly behind us in a certain form. And what he's getting at in that quote is that it's one thing to kind of know something's in the past. It's another thing to feel it on a much more kind of existential level of one's psyche, individual psyche, collective psyche. Okay, this next quote, and these are all the quotes, so it's not going to go on forever. This one's kind of long and beefy, and it really is kind of the heart of the matter. A truth commission can winnow out the facts upon which society's arguments with itself should be conducted, but it cannot bring those arguments to a conclusion. The past is an argument, and the function of truth commissions, like the function of honest historians, is simply to purify the argument, to narrow the range of permissible lies. Truth commissions have the greatest chance of success in societies that already have created a powerful consensus behind reconciliation, such as in South Africa. In places like the former Yugoslavia, on the other hand, where the parties have murdered and tortured one another for years, the prospects for truth, reconciliation, and justice are much bleaker. I'm going to come back to this. Let me just kind of lodge a question right now. We're in the United States of America. We're talking about the United States of America. There are problems everywhere. We could talk about that. We're kind of talking about our own. Is America more like South Africa, or is America more like Yugoslavia? So kind of where does America fit on this spectrum? If there's a spectrum of kind of consensus behind reconciliation, more or less, South Africa's on the more side, Yugoslavia's on the less side. Where is the United States in that? Okay, resistance to historical truth. Well, it's actually, sorry, let me read this. It's a couple ones down. That's the real gem. All of these are good, but there's one that's the real standout. Resistance to historical truth is a function of group identity. Nations and peoples weave their sense of themselves into narcissistic narratives that strenuously resist correction. Let me read these next two. Myth is a version of the past that refuses to be just the past. Myth is a narrative shaped by desire, not by truth, formed not by facts as best we can establish them, but by our longing to be reassured and consoled. So in this earlier quote where he talks about kind of the body and the mind, the head and the heart, or however you want to define up, logic versus emotion, reason versus emotion. When one deals with the complexity of the past and violence in the past, and that is still lingering because survivors or family members of victims are all living together, that's not just a matter of one's mind. That's not just a matter of telling them the facts. Okay, it's this next quote that, in my opinion, is the real standout, and it relates to what I was just saying. Myth is so much sustained by the inner world, by paranoia, desire, and longing, that it is dissolved not when facts from the outer world contradict it, but only when the inner need for it ebbs away. So again, we're not simply talking about facts. We're talking about psychological needs. These needs are related to people's sense of identity, their sense of themselves. That's honestly what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the class tonight. Let me just read through the rest of these, and then I'm kind of get the takeaway points and move on from there. I'll check this question real fast. Someone wrote in the chat box. To me, this is all young and collective unconscious. Yeah, let's see, we get into psychological territory here, which I am completely fine with, but I'm not an expert in. So various theories. There's something, Freud comes up in this. There's this important thing. This is worth pausing on. Because there's something, a quote that I did not include. It's about this thing called screen memories. And what that is, okay, we're looking at a screen right now. That's not what I mean. You know, the screen of my phone, a movie screen, etc. In military terms, a screening force is the force that is kind of out there as your shield. Like you have your main body, the main body of your army, and then you have a screening force, which is supposed to be kind of alerting you to enemies, and protecting the main body of the force inside. And a screen memory are basically lies or myths that people tell themselves in order to protect their true self. This gets into psychological stuff that I'm not an expert in talking about that, but I really like that notion that both individually and collectively we construct myths because we can't look at the truth. So what is it to look at the truth of past events that maybe we didn't participate in, but that our tribe did? And then how can we move on from that? Okay, now in these last two quotes, we get to the major theme of this class. When it comes to healing, one is faced with the most mysterious process of all. For what seems apparent in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and in South Africa is that the past continues to torment because it is not past. He says more positive things about South Africa than he does these other places, but still in times or moments, episodes when the past lingers or comes roaring back, South Africa takes a step backwards. Excuse me. Okay, now here's this last one. Reconciliation, now we get to a good Christian term, means breaking down the spiral of intergenerational vengeance, basically the same thing. It means substituting the vicious downward spiral of violence with the virtuous upward spiral of mutually reinforcing respect. And I had to add these words, for the living and the dead. That's what he's talking about, but it doesn't show up in the quote. Without an apology, without recognition of what happened, the past cannot return to its place as the past. Okay, so without an apology, if one does not have an apology, if one does not recognize what happened, the past cannot return to its place of the past. Okay, let me highlight some takeaway points here that I want to make about this. And there are three of them, actually. Sorry, let me go back to the quotes so you can see them for yourselves. Up here in this big quote, Truth commissions have the greatest chance of success in societies that already have created a powerful consensus behind reconciliation. I want to key on that. I also want to key on this quote here about the second one about myth. Myth is so much sustained by the inner world, by paranoia, desire, and longing, that it is dissolved not when facts from the outer world contradict it, but only when the inner need for it ebbs away. In terms of, and I'll come back to the other quote in just a second. In terms of what we can do as people of faith, as well-intentioned Americans who are trying to do something about this, I think that we can contribute to creating this powerful consensus, as well as diminishing the needs of people, the psychological needs. But I'm sorry to say, this is very slow, painstaking work. This is about changing individual minds. This is about listening to people. This is about trying to convince them of different stories, or including people in stories in ways that they haven't been included before. That's not the work of a single rally. That's not the work of a single Bible study class, or any semester-long class that I teach. It's a very long process to create a consensus. That takes a very long time. So in terms of what do we do now, I'm sorry to say that this is very incremental. This is going to be like digging a tunnel. It's like Shawshank Redemption. It's going to be digging a tunnel with a spoon. We'll get there, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So just I'm buckling up for the long haul. This is a lifetime's worth of work. It's turning an aircraft carrier. So there's the consensus, and then in terms of the internal needs, this is what I'm going to talk about in the second half of the class a decent bit. And I'm going to speak, and I hope if this makes people uncomfortable or something, I definitely don't mean to. I am going to speak in kind of racialized terms, while hopefully not being racist. And in particular, I am speaking to and about white people, which I can do a little bit more easily because I am a white person. And I also understand within the white community that I come from, when white people don't get certain things. And I kind of understand why they don't get it. And it relates to certain larger psychological needs. I don't want to demean the people that I'm in conversation with by categorizing them in some way and dismissing them after I've categorized them. But I do understand what some of these needs are, and it's worth talking about this. In terms of, he puts it in terms of paranoia, desire, longing. These are all not positive. Well, longing can be, but these are not necessarily positive emotions that people are experiencing. So I'll say more about that and what comes up. But these inner needs, identifying them and then trying to deflate them or kind of sap them of their energy and their power is a very, very painstaking process. Okay, last of all, in terms of things to do, I want to quote, focus on this last quote here. Reconciliation means substituting the vicious downward spiral of violence with the virtuous upward spiral of mutually reinforcing respect. When I read this, when I was prepping for tonight's class, honestly, this is something that I've just thought of in the last 24 hours. I thought, why don't we in the United States have a monument to enslaved Americans? And as all of these monuments are being torn down, why don't we? And let me explain why I think that would be an important thing. Okay, a number of years ago, as you know, I'm a gigantic history nerd, and I went out to Promontory Point, Utah, which is where the Transcontinental Rail, the East and the West line met, and they drove the Golden Spike. And I was there actually on May 10. That was the day that the Golden Spike was driven, and they have a ceremony, and these trains come in, and they have historical reenactors and stuff like that, and it's all kind of nerd paradise. But I asked the people, it's a national park, I believe, or maybe a state park. I said, why is there not a monument here to the Chinese workers? And I'm not, I don't know, I'm not usually up in people's faces about these kinds of things, but there was a monument to the workers, I believe, from the East, who were predominantly Irish. There was not a monument to the workers who were Chinese, who were building from the West going east, from California, eventually in Utah. I'll say more about the Chinese in a minute. That saddened me. I thought that was inexcusable. The main reason why, what the excuse is that most of those Chinese laborers were unbelievably poor, from unbelievably poor circumstances in China, and were illiterate, almost uniformly illiterate. So there weren't records. So a monument to them, anything that would include their name, is difficult to establish because those names are not recorded. But everybody knows that it was Chinese laborers who did that. I believe those people need to be honored for the sacrifices and the work that they did. In exactly the same way, I believe that enslaved Americans from 1619 to 1865 should be not just memorialized, not just remembered in some kind of public monument, but honored as a result of it and honored through it. And the reason why I didn't get to kind of finish this point last week, brought it up to 1865, but I think I can express this relatively clearly and straightforwardly. The United States was not built by white people only. I mean, that goes without saying. It's been, I hesitate to use the word partnership because that involves, if one says this is my partner, there's a kind of recognition or of equality in that, or at least, okay, this might be my boss and I'm the coffee boy or something like that. Slave owner and slave is not exactly partnering. But this country would not have been built without enslaved African and African American labor. And not just in terms of creating wealth and creating, clearing trees and planting fields and bringing in crops and stuff like that, but honestly, the invisibility of the slave class allowed for even the concept of all these white people talking about equality. We're equal, we're going to fight Britain, Declaration of Independence, created equal, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, hey, by the way, who made this wonderful meal that I'm eating right now? Oh, it was all the slaves in the kitchen. Who, what? Okay, whatever. You know that the slaves were there, but you just don't see them. But white Americans and Black Americans created this country. Some kind of monument to bring honor to them, to that memory, I think would be absolutely the thing to do in terms of reinforcing respect for the living and the dead. I literally just thought, why does this not exist? This is in the last 24 hours. So this is not something I had on my mind 2 weeks ago in our class, or even last week in our class, or even 48 hours ago. I looked this up. They're actually, I just typed in, I Googled monument to enslaved Americans. And I love what I found, which is at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's university. They did this. They created a monument to enslaved laborers, the enslaved laborers who built the University of Virginia, and they finished it less than 6 months ago. They could not have an opening ceremony for that. This is so recent. It was kind of in conversation since about 2010. Then in 2017 in Charlottesville, when the Klan marched, they really accelerated this for very good reason. Got the money for it, designed it, constructed it, but they couldn't have a ribbon cutting ceremony because it happened in April and coronavirus had happened. I just want to say what they did at the University of Virginia, I think should be done on the national level. I think that there should be something on the National Mall. This was supposedly proposed a couple of years ago, and Congress allotted money for it to create the Museum of African American History, which I think was the better thing to do. Rather do that first, create a space where people can go and learn and not just commemorate, but something that honors, so that people could go and see my ancestors built this place. Anyway, I'm interested in exploring this further before I say anything publicly about it. I mean, I would love to try to get something written, op-ed pieces to kind of drum up support for this, petitions. I don't know, but I need to learn a lot more. So I want to kind of learn before I leap on it. But it's just something that I'd like to kind of bring up as a possibility to be thought about. It's a very grand possibility. Okay. Does anybody have any question about anything I've said? This is the abstract part. And the main point that I want to make is, and this is why this article was so mind-blowing for me, is my job is to tell historical stories. And hopefully those stories land someplace. And then I don't want to determine the outcome. I think racism's bad. I would like for people to walk away thinking racism's bad, rather than, hey, well, this happened, so what? But what amazed me about this is it's not, you can't just tell the story. Okay, people who used to hate and kill one another, let me tell you what the story is. You were the bad guys, you were the victims, now deal with that and get along. That's just too psychologically complex for people. It's too psychologically demanding to ask them to do that. So this thing that I do, this thing that I'm trained to do in a classroom and in an academic setting, it's not necessarily counterproductive, but it's surprisingly not as productive as I would expect it to be to changing people's minds because of these psychological needs that they have within them. Again, I just want to identify this is a new frontier of knowledge for me. It's very messy because it deals with people's identities and people's psychology individually and collectively. But I'm very excited to kind of explore this further into the future. Okay. Again, any questions about the abstract part before I move on to the more concrete part?
No, not from me.
Okay, cool. Okay, I don't have a quote of this, but needless to say, these last 4 years have been unpleasant for Americans. I'd probably say the last 5 years. And as I've been kind of navigating this with everyone, okay, what is going on? I'm not kidding about this. I think the people who have some of the greatest insight are comedians. People who laugh, people who see the kind of ridiculousness of a set of circumstances, ridiculousness of a system, and then kind of call it out and laugh about it. Not only do I love it because I love laughing, but the insights that there's many comedians that I could quote. Just to stay focused on this, there's the person who made the most sense of the election of 2016 to me was Jon Stewart. So after the election happened, everyone's, what is going on? What is going on? What happened? And just so you know, full disclosure here, I might have said this before. I used to be a Republican. So I'm not, most academics are left of center. I am now left of center, but I wasn't always left of center. So if I say something that sounds kind of negative or something like that, and I don't want to be overly political in a church thing, please know that that was my tribe. Those were my politics. And so I'm not just kind of jumping on the bandwagon of beating Republicans and Trump in particular like a piñata and feeling really good about it. I understand the Republican perspective because I shared it. Okay, what Jon Stewart said I thought was just completely brilliant. America is not normal. And what he said after that was, what is normal is tribalism. He knows very well the tribalism of the Middle East. He knows the tribalism of Africa and places where there is intense and horrible sectarian violence. He personally is very interested in making movies about that, telling stories about it, raising awareness about it. What he meant by that and what I took from it, and I think he's absolutely right, what America is trying to do, one of the goals of the American experiment is to dissolve tribal identities and tribal loyalties. You can call this the melting pot, you can call it kind of whatever you want to call it. There's always some kind of problems with that, but I think in general there's more truth to it than falsity. But why I like that is I do think it's absolutely right to say what is normal, sadly, is tribalism. We go to places that are safe. We surround ourselves with people who are like ourselves. And as tribes do, you fight to secure resources for yourself and your tribe over other people's tribes. In the United States, we are divided up by race and ethnicity in all different kinds of ways. We're dividing into Republican and Democrat tribes. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. That's just politics. Better to have two tribes than a bunch of them where things get more complicated. But ethnically, and this is why I think this is so important and relevant for us in Los Angeles. And this is why I just love this city. I love it. I love the fact that basically every ethnicity and race and religion we're all living together. I think of Los Angeles as a concentrated laboratory in the American experiment. If we're all supposed to be cramming into this continent and figuring out how to live together, Los Angeles is that in microcosm. Can we do it? Can we all live together? So I've quoted a comedian, there's a political scientist, who said a very similar thing after the 2016 election. He said something I thought was just really spot on, which is ethnic groups in the United States in the two-party system tend to gravitate towards one party or another. Cuban Americans are diehard Republicans. I don't know if you know that. African Americans are predominantly Democrat. Other Hispanic Americans are predominantly Democrat. You can kind of like, okay, what's the ethnicity? What party do they gravitate towards? But what he said is, what we're seeing now is whites acting politically, behaving politically like a minority, and that there is a certain resurgence of white tribalism in the election of 2016. I think that was a very astute thing to say, that white people are starting to feel beleaguered, they're circling the wagons and are behaving in a certain tribalistic way, which has, and by the way, I don't mean for tribalism to I hope that you're not offended in my using that word, and I hope you understand what I mean by it. But when other ethnicities are kind of behaving tribalistically in terms of in block voting and that kind of thing, white people are doing that for the first time in a way that was surprising, at least to this political scientist. Okay, what I want to spend the rest of tonight talking about is white tribalism. What it is, why it is, what episodes there have been of it in the past, and what episodes there are of it potentially in the present. Okay, this article that I shared with you that I think is brilliant. It has something very important that I think is missing from it, which I'm going to explain in just a second. Let me talk first about identity. And these quotes of this fear, and this fear of loss of identity, and this fear of having one's identity redefined by an outside source in a way that one might find unpleasant. There is a fear among whites, some whites, that white America is fading. These are demographic realities. I have zero problem with them. Some white people have tremendous problems with them. California does not, I can't remember what year it was. California does not have a majority race anymore. Whites were the majority, then at some point, so if you think of a pie chart, whites were for however long, way more than 50%. In some year, in the last 20 years, I can't remember when, whites have slipped under 50%. So because California is so diverse, there are all of these slices of the pie, some of them very tiny, but there's no ethnic group that is over 50%. We seem to be doing fine with that. California, it hasn't led to, California is a very blue state, it's a forward-looking state. It doesn't necessarily turn into tribalism as a result of that. There is other white tribalism in California that I'm going to explain next. It's really, really ugly. But as goes California, so goes America. Some people, especially if they kind of entertain white nationalist understandings of things, are terrified by this. And by these predictions that by the year 2050 or whatever the year that social scientists are projecting out, there will not be a majority race in the entire United States, and that the entire United States will look like California. I celebrate this. I seriously jump up and down and I'm thrilled about it. Not because I'm a self-loathing white or something, but because I'm actually a proud multicultural American. And I love seeing all of these people come to America and share in America's greatness. And can we all get along and live together? I think we can. I'm actually optimistic about that. And I think it's beautiful. I think it's much more beautiful than kind of lily white America. Some white Americans look at this with profound terror. After 2016, a number of documentaries were made, and especially after 2017, when Charlottesville happened, there was one documentary I watched where they interviewed members of the Ku Klux Klan, and this one, I don't know what his position was, wizard, dragon, whatever. And he said, he just looked like a businessman. He looked like he could be running a bank. And he said, in however many years, my civilization will be over. That is what some white folks are fearing. There's a term for this in the kind of, I believe in the alt-right, I believe in other forms, called replacement theory, and that whites are going to be replaced by these brown races, brown and black races, and then down goes civilization. But this replacement theory is profoundly psychologically embedded in people with tremendous fear. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't want to just completely, talk ridiculously. I think it comes from just a fear of death, a fear. We die, we disappear. Maybe we're remembered, maybe we're not, on an individual level, and also on an entirely collective level. What if my civilization goes away? I won't be remembered in everything in my tribe. So it's kind of this link from the individual to the tribe, and this fear of that. Okay, I've got 20 minutes left. Let me give you, now let me get to the concrete and the history. I'm gonna give you a quick history of the Klan. Okay, here is the Ku Klux Klan. I actually just lectured on this on Monday. Just so you know, this is what I tell my students, it is the Ku Klux Klan, not the Klu Klux Klan. I'm not saying that because I want to make sure that you spell the name of this great organization, accurately, just so you know, just so you use accurate terms. Ku Klux Klan. A student a long time ago asked me, what does that come from anyway? And I actually didn't know, which was, so I'm actually a little happy that I didn't know where it came from. And then the student looked it up on the internet. When you look up the Ku Klux Klan on the internet, it's a dangerous thing to do because you could go to very weird and frightening places. Ku Klux is a Greek word that means circle or unity. And so how all these rednecks found this Greek word and said, that's it, that'll be what we call ourselves, I have no idea. But it's supposed to be this racial unity. That's where it comes from. The Ku Klux Klan is a reactionary organization. And what I mean by that is they look at an event, the present, and they react against it, and they want to go backwards in time. I think of politics as basically in political ideology is kind of a debate of, do you like the present? If you do, you're a conservative. If you want to move forward, you're a progressive. If you want to move back, you're reactionary. Ku Klux Klan is reactionary. And the Ku Klux Klan wants to go back. And whenever society is moving quickly, when there's a lot of change, that's when you get a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it's almost like a scientific stimuli and response. In the 1860s and 1870s, after the Civil War, all of these recently freed slaves, this is not the world that Confederate soldiers want. They formed the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is basically a continuation of the Civil War through terrorism and guerrilla tactics, especially terrorism, and especially in voting. I actually just saw something on I don't know if this is a big story or if it's just a kind of smaller episode. I think it was in the state of North Carolina, and people had Biden signs out in their yard. And then right next to the Biden sign were all of these leaflets from the Ku Klux Klan, saying, the Klan has now paid you a social visit. Make sure we don't make you a business visit next. That's voter intimidation. And it went on last week by the Klan to stop forward progress. The 1860s and 1870s Klan was clearly anti-Black, and targeted primarily on freed slaves. It died down a little bit. The membership died down. It then surged again after World War I. There's all this societal change. Society's moving very fast in the 1920s, and the Ku Klux Klan was revived in the 1920s. And there was a march. I said this to my students again just a couple days ago. I'm almost 50 years old. So I've been walking this planet for half a century. I have never, and I'm from Alabama. I've never in my life seen a Klan rally. Maybe I had opportunities to in Alabama. I don't know. I didn't seek them out, but I never saw one just incidentally, like, oh, it's the time when the Klan marches. I've never seen a Klan rally until 2017 in Charlottesville. In that rally, there were hundreds of people, maybe over 1,000. In 1925, there were thousands, potentially into the tens of thousands of Klan full regalia marching down the streets of the capital, Washington, D.C., broad daylight, not tiki torches with some kind of fear of what might happen next. Those guys were very scared, and I'm not defending them, but they were scared because they're outnumbered. In the 1920s, they were not outnumbered. They marched proudly. That says something about where American society was at the time. And then the Klan gets revived when the Civil Rights Movement gets started in the 1950s. Okay, I've got 15 minutes left. Oh, here is the thing. So I've talked about tribal identity and people's fear of losing themselves, losing their country, losing their larger collectivity. And I do want to focus on this on white people and this kind of white fear that a certain America is passing. There's another comedian that honestly I learned tons from. Okay, what is our moment like? Why is our moment the way that it is? This is a strange thing to say in church, perhaps. I love South Park. I think South Park is officially the most brilliant show ever. It is just, I laugh. I laughed so hard in one South Park thing. I got over a cold. I laughed my phlegm out and my fever broke. I laughed so hard. In addition to laughing a lot, they said a lot about that the 2016 election was all about nostalgia. And that, I think that hits the nail absolutely on the head. But again, it is a white nostalgia. It's a nostalgia for this kind of small town, and when America was strong and powerful and good, and predominantly white. Pictures of the NASA technicians and astronauts who sent people to the moon. So it's a bunch of white men. D-Day, it's a bunch of white guys storming the beach. So like, okay, that back when America was doing great, and look, the images that we have are predominantly white people, and a sense that that's fading, and a sense that we don't really know what's going to happen next, but it scares us. Okay. So that has to do with the identity part. Here's the thing that article missed. Actually, before I get to this, let me check the chat here. Okay. Okay, the member berries. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it was the member berries. It was just completely brilliant. Okay, someone wrote here, people in my neighborhood in Tuscaloosa have to put warning signs on their Doug Jones signs, warning them that stealing them is a crime, and quoting the statutes. Interesting documentary by Scottish historian who put the Klan into the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, cool. I'll try to check those out. Those weren't questions; those are more comments. So if it's all right, I'm just gonna move on forward here. Okay, the thing that article misses. So the kind of situation that he goes into, which is an unbelievably difficult situation, is right after groups of people have been killing each other. Okay, now let's try to get along. Let's try to put the past behind us, reconcile, move forward as a society. The different groups in Rwanda who are macheteing one another, how do you continue to live as Rwanda after that? The one thing that article does not talk about is economic self-interest, and in particular, economic tribalism. And what I mean by this is not just, hey, can we get along? And what is our identity? And there's more of you coming in. Oh no, there's all these Mexicans in America now. Now, what does that mean for white America? Am I going to disappear, like this Klansman said? And then there's also just, I want a job for my white children. And previously, when people of color did not have as much access to education and to these jobs, white people didn't have as much competition. Now they do. That is impacting things. So the history that I want to give you now in the last 10 minutes from 1865 to 1955, I'm going to focus on California. This is a 10-minute history of white tribalism in California. It actually goes from prior to 1865, but I teach a class in California history. Here's the short version. It is a revolving door of minority oppression. Okay, whites were the majority pretty much always. So what was the largest minority community? After that, they got hurt over and over and over again. I don't know if you know, so let me start out first by talking about the native peoples, the native Californians. I don't know if y'all know this. In the state of California, it is actually appropriate to use the word genocide to talk about what Californians did to the native peoples. White people could bring in scalps and evidence that they had killed native peoples. And I forget the dates of this, when this started and when it concluded. So not just white people killing Indians because they feared them or because they wanted their land or something like that. When they would bring these scalps in, the state of California reimbursed them. It was a bounty. And then the state of California was actually reimbursed by the federal government. This is state-sponsored murder of a people group. From the individual white Californians pulling those triggers to the state system that's reimbursing them for that, to the United States itself that's reimbursing the state of California to do that. I don't know if y'all knew that. I said last week, I'm from Alabama, where the kind of the horror of the racial history is more kind of present and in your face. In California, we just forget about it and keep moving forward. There's a way in which there's health to that. Okay, let's just keep moving forward, but everybody forgets, and there are not monuments around to remember this. Okay, that's what happened to the native Californians. Guess what happened to the Mexicans? As soon as California became a state, or as soon as the gold was discovered and all of these Argonauts start flooding into the gold fields, they wanted to exclude foreigners from this, in particular Mexicans. There's a way in which I'm a little bit divided on this. This might sound strange to say. There's a racial element to this because most of the non-Americans there would not be considered white. They might be Chinese or Mexican. Some came from Argentina. And so they established a foreign miners tax. So if you come in to dig for gold, but you're not an American, you have to pay extra to have the right to dig for that gold. I don't know if I necessarily have a problem with that, because like, what if gold was discovered in Canada, and then all these white Americans flood up into Canada, and the Canadians say, hey, look, this is our gold, go home or pay more money for it. Race might not have figured into that. So there's kind of like, okay, this is on your land, this is your resource, maybe the resource is for your people. But there is a racial element as well to kind of kick the foreigners out who are also non-white. This is a good example of racial tribalism. Okay, I've mentioned the Chinese. When the railroad was being built, they had very difficult time at first. Getting it constructed is really just unbelievably challenging work, logistically, all kinds of ways. And they experimented with different things and then kind of found the Chinese work very well. The Chinese are fantastic workers in this trade, in this skill. So encourage more Chinese people to come over and then work. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting when the Transcontinental Railroad was started. I think it was 1862, but it's finished in 1869. That's when the Golden Spike was driven. And then everyone was building railroads like mad after the Civil War in all different parts of the country. And the Chinese were fantastic laborers for that. Then there was a massive recession that began in 1873 that lasted from 1873 to 1879. And as soon as the economy turned from boom to bust, the Chinese were not welcome. We want you for your labor. We're happy to have you for your labor. Now the jobs have gone away and there are all these Chinese people around here. We don't really want you here. And when jobs became scarce, and this is what it's about, when jobs become scarce, tribalism gets ramped up in a major, major way. This also, I believe, is what happened after the financial crisis of 2008. When all of a sudden resources become more scarce, people retreat into their tribes where they feel safer and that they can potentially be provided for. It also boosts their identity and gives them a sense of place and purpose, etc. But this is not rocket science. Whenever there is an economic downturn, there's a certain sad ethnic tribalism over fighting for those scarce jobs. And these are examples of when whites do act tribally. One last thing on this. Sorry, I have a number of points to keep making about this. So what ends up coming as a result of this is the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, so it took years for this to get passed, but ultimately this is the immigration form of building a wall. You can't build a wall on the Pacific coast and keep out Asian people from getting into America, but you can tighten up your immigration laws. And when Chinese laborers went from being an asset, hey, fantastic, build us all these railroads. Now, thank you. That's why is there not a monument to them? They built the railroads, thank you. And now there are not jobs around. Now we just don't want you. This is the story that I told you about Barbados is one of my top 5 saddest stories in history. This also, what I'm about to tell you, is in my top 5 saddest stories in history. When the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect in 1882, and it was not reversed for 80 years. For 60 years. Now do the math on that. 1882 to 1942, the United States is in World War II. The United States now has China as an ally fighting the Japanese. Hey, yeah, sorry about that whole Chinese Exclusion Act thing. Now we can be buddies again. But the sadness of this story is this: it was almost exclusively Chinese men, who came over to do this work. Then they weren't appreciated, wanted for their work anymore, and so then the spigot was shut off. No more Chinese people could come over, men or women, and especially women didn't come over. And so that entire generation of men, I don't know, there's just something just incredibly lonely about this. This entire generation of Chinese men just died out. They stuck together, they speak Chinese together and enjoy their culture together, and they just got old and died. They were not able to have wives because there weren't Chinese women, and white women, other women didn't want to marry them. And so they did all this work, they hung out together, and they died. I don't know why. That just hits me in this incredibly sad way. And that's why I think people like that should be remembered. All right, that's a certain white tribalism against the Chinese. Japanese internment in the 1940s is another form of white tribalism. What is utterly fascinating about this to me is that in Hawaii was not a state when Pearl Harbor happened, but the United States could make laws. Hawaii had more Japanese people in it than California did, but in part because the Japanese people in Hawaii there were so many of them, they were vital to the economy. But in Hawaii, there was this culture of people Filipinos and Japanese and Chinese and whites. Okay, we're all working together. I mean, there was tension. It wasn't utopia, but there wasn't this hatred and this fear of the Japanese, and the suspicion that if you're Japanese racially, you must automatically be willing to die for the emperor. In California, because of paranoia, because of xenophobia, and because of a long history of this, it was that culture within California which created the culture, which created the background for the Japanese internment. And again, this is and those Japanese people lost their property. that they weren't able to get that again. One last thing in California, just to kind of point out the fact of a certain form of white tribalism, is our redlining policies. So after World War II and before World War II, okay, these neighborhoods are for different people. And we want the whites living in this neighborhood. And then, if a black person moves into that neighborhood, well, there goes the neighborhood. That was the thought at the time. And so there were these highly restrictive policies within the legal systems of certain municipalities, and then also banks would not loan to people of color so that they could get mortgages and live in these types of neighborhoods. Every single one of these episodes that I've just said in 10 minutes, I could talk about for at least an hour, each and every one of them. But what I want to point out is, if you've ever wondered, okay, this concept of white privilege, okay, what exactly is it? This is when things get written into the laws of cities, municipalities, states, nations that benefit one group, one tribe, to the detriment of the other. And there is a long history of this. And I didn't write these laws. I'm not complicit in constructing them. I simply want to raise consciousness of the way in which white people have been privileged, have been benefited by American society. It's not an equal starting place. In the race of life, in a meritocratic system where the best and brightest are supposed to advance, it's not a fair race. It's not a fair foot race. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I went right up to 8 o'clock. Is there time for if anybody wants to ask questions?
I was struck going back to the very beginning passage when you were talking about myth and how it'll be dissolved when the inner need ebbs away. Because I'm always like, if you tell the stories, if you tell people history and you educate, they'll learn. But it's not the external telling of stories that's going to make a difference. It's an internal change. And that's a struggle. But I think it's kind of nailed in that quote that's kind of how you get to this. That's hard.
That's exactly why it's so mind-blowing for me. And it's not that what I've been doing is wrong. It's just that if that is
what you're up against,
I aim to educate. I mean, and then lessons can be taken from that. My class is not, Mr. Rogers and like, here's how to go and be a good person. I want people to be a good person, but I want to convey the material and tell the story as best I can. And they can do, I think it'd be overly kind of intrusive and leading and potentially biased of me to do that. But so what I'm doing is not wrong, but if in certain contexts, I am interested in getting groups of people to reconcile or to understand the pain and the trauma and the injustices of the past. It's not just, okay, I show up and I tell the story and then everyone walks away enlightened and loving one another. It's a much more complicated psychological process and dynamic that, okay, don't do that or don't expect that. And so what are the angles of attack on this? What are the things that we can do? This is going to require a lot more study and work on my part. I'm actually, in addition to I am sometime soon going to make a huge bibliography of Michael Ignatieff's work, read as much as I can about him and what he's done. Miroslav Volf is also, he's a Christian theologian who was at Fuller Seminary. He's big on this, and I want to read his stuff and kind of get hooked in with him about this as well. But I'm glad that it struck you, Katie, also as this is hard. This is a challenge. Hello, Ann, David, and Pooch. Yes, Lucy.
I was just going to say this hardness of like, here's what I do, and this isn't actually what's needed. Society needs something else to manage this. Strikes me a lot as what I went through facing the fact that just telling people about earthquakes and how to understand them wasn't enough. That people had to be taken by the hand and carried through to how it's understood and used. And
Hmm.
it struck me as being a really similar thing. And at some point, you and I should probably just sit down and share experiences on that. The other one, this whole thing of the idea of a monument to the Chinese. One of the things that struck me when I was writing about the big California flood is that they have no idea how many Chinese died. They're pretty sure it may very well have been a majority of the people who died in the flood because it wiped away mining camps. But one of the reasons they even know about it at all is because of the Chinese tongues in San Francisco. And there were records of people there's some idea of who the Chinese were because they communicated through their own system. It wasn't at all within the California government.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder to what extent the knowledge of who those people were might be there more than we think, because it's so central to Chinese culture to be your family and all of those things. And there may be records within the traditional Chinese organizations, especially in San Francisco. And it might be worth trying to figure out if we could figure out who they were. It might be there.
Yeah, and there are historians. There's one historian at Stanford. I can't remember his name right now. He's a Chinese American, and he's working on this. He spoke at Pepperdine, and I heard him.
Okay.
I can't remember what his name is right now. But he said, yeah, some of the research that he does is go out to places where the work camps were and do basically archaeology, like pick up objects, stuff that was left there 150 years ago. Which is pretty interesting, but it just shows the kind of difficulty of doing some of that.
Okay.
Work. Yeah, were you going to say anything else, Lucy? Did I cut you off?
Well, no, I guess the one other thing is that I learned about the Japanese internment camps as a teenager in California, having never heard about them till I took one particular junior high school history class in 1968. And I remember both sort of my feeling of, remember screaming about, how could you not tell me? Getting really upset at my parents. But at that point of learning of it, I'd say that my impression is that the economics of taking the land away from the Japanese
that
maybe even been a highly motivating factor within it.
Yeah, it also it's again, every single one of these I don't know it backwards and forwards, but I know more than I conveyed in in the 10-minute lightning.
Right.
But one of the things, the Army commander in charge of this was terrified that what happened at Pearl Harbor and military heads roll after that would happen, that California would get attacked and his head would roll. And a preemptive way to make that not happen was to intern all of these and all of these Japanese people. So it was just kind of a cover your butt military move.
Right.
But many of these other levels, there are many other things going on culturally, economically.
Right, and you can go, like you say, go through these from a what's motivating them and look at Terminal Island. Out here in Long Beach, where a lot of the Japanese worked on canneries and had homes or gardeners up on the west side. And like you say, Lucy, you can really identify which homes they went and took. So it like you say, there's an economic aspect behind and motivated from that piece of it.
Reverend Ann, do you have a question? You look like you're, and I hope you're feeling well.
It would be a good field trip for you to see St. Mary's Church, Mariposa. It was a Japanese congregation where the entire congregation was sent off to an internment camp, including the rector. And when you go to that church and their stained glass windows, they depict that. And it's still mostly a Japanese congregation today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for you to go see the stained glass windows and talk to some of the senior citizens there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Let me check these two. There are two questions in the chat thing. Okay, someone wrote, "Can I email out the article I showed at the beginning?" Yes, I can definitely share that. It's just a single sheet with these quotes, so that should be pretty easy. And someone wrote, "I recently read the book Caste." Yeah. By Isabel Wilkerson, is an excellent perspective on how we got here. That book, the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, there's some books that are kind of big, kind of bestsellers as people are wrestling with this, and I haven't read them yet. I look forward to reading them. Hopefully what I'm saying works in concert with them and is not opposed to anything that they're saying. But I don't know how they package the material and exactly what their perspective is on things, but I hear really good things about those books. So part of checking them out. Any other thoughts or questions anybody like to share?
Just a comment. I was not able to make the first two sessions and looked at them online, and just, this is so enriching. I am just so pleasantly surprised at your presentation, the information. It's just been a really great experience, and I'm really looking forward to next week. And thank you so much. You can tell you've put a lot of time into it, and it's just excellent, Stewart.
Well,
so
you.
I just thank you so much.
It's an honor to do this. I love this church. I really do. I'm honored to be a part of it. I can't wait for us to get back. And this helps me because I want to do something. like all of us, we're at home watching television, pulling our hair out and wanting the world to change and us to do something to help the world change. Hopefully this is helping in some form or fashion, but at least I feel like I can contribute to in some way. I told Lucy, Governor Newsom is forming this Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the state of California to talk about potential reparations for slaves that were in California. It's a very minuscule amount and not a very big part of the state of California's history. But I think it's really good. He's the first state. He's the first governor. It's the first state to do that. I was like, I want on that commission. I don't think I have the CV and the star power to be one of the 9 members of it. But I want to contribute. I would love to contribute to that in some way, shape, or form. I will be a coffee boy for that commission if that's what it takes, as long as I could be involved.
Which reminds me, I've got a path for how to at least offer, and you and I need to talk.
Awesome.
It's who are your assemblymen, and anyway, let's. I think I know your assemblyman and senator, and that's the path you take. Okay,
very cool. Very cool.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I want to, like I said, be respectful of your time. But if there's anything else,
Thank you.
All righty. Take care.
Seriously, yeah.